He has no bad intentions, he just wants a peaceful life. But those voices, they want war. And so our story begins long ago, in a world far, far away. This was the 505th world to be created within the Minecraft universe, and it was governed by the ancestral spirit, Spirit 505. He was the god of this land, and his essence was tied to the success of it. And for just over 4.5 billion years, everything was going perfectly. Life had developed on this land thanks to Spirit 505, and it was starting to get rather complex, as they were just beginning to develop space travel. It was amazing. Spirit 505 had never been so powerful. But then one day a book arrived on his world. It was a red glowing book. That was strange. He was the god of this world, and had complete control. But he didn't make that book. It shouldn't be here. And so confused by its existence, he ventured towards the book. Foolishly, in his attempt to learn about this mysterious item, he decided to pick it up. In just a fraction of a second, the book expanded into a giant demonic red crystal. For a brief moment, there was calm, and Spirit 505 was mesmerized by the crystal's aura. But then, a brutal shockwave emanated from the crystal. It was so strong that in just a few minutes, it had travelled across the entire world, killing any life that it encountered. Spirit 505 survived, and by this time he realised that this was an attack, unless he fought back, as he tried to push against the force of the shockwave. He was a god after all. But it was too much. He lost the battle. All these billions of years of progress, lost in an instant. As life on his world died, Spirit 505 began to rapidly weaken. He shrunk in size, and he stopped glowing as brightly. As a result of the loss of his power, the sun began to darken, and the sky turned dark red due to the lack of light. The crystal emanated a second shockwave, and once again the spirit tried to push back, but he was too weak, and he lost the battle. His form was deteriorating. Wave after wave came, and by the fifth wave almost everything in that world was destroyed. Spirit 505 had become just a shell of his former self. His godly scales no longer glowed. His body was dull and damaged. His eyes were black. He could still fly, and he was technically still an ancestral spirit, or god, but in his view, he wasn't a god anymore. He was worthless. He had failed to protect his world, and no longer felt like a spirit. Thus, he didn't want to be referred to as Spirit 505. Instead, he was just Entity 505, a meaningless, useless entity. He was a failure, but then he heard it. It was a voice promising to save him. Desperate, he flew towards the voice. It was urging him to continue following. With nothing else to do, he ventured even closer towards the voice. Over the next few days, the voice grew into many voices, and they seemed demonic. But still, he followed them, and after many days, he reached the source of the voices. But it was that crystal. It had just destroyed him and his world, but now it was offering to save him? That didn't seem right. But his morale and hope had melted into nothingness at this point, and so he believed that following these voices might just be his only way to fix things, and so reluctantly, he drew even closer to that crystal, and eventually, he touched it. And with that, Entity 505 was transported to a new world, and this place was known as the Overworld. But that didn't matter to Entity 505, for he was cold. He was in the desert during the dead of night, so that was somewhat to be expected. But regardless, he hated this freezing feeling. He had never had to feel cold back when he was a spirit. He was effectively the embodiment of warmth, and heat, and power. Well, back then he was, but not anymore. But still, that didn't change the discomfort that he was now enduring. He didn't want to be cold anymore, but luckily he saw light. It was a small village in the distance. It seemed very primitive, but he was just happy to have been transported near such a structure. As he flew in, he stood by the illuminated torches, and for the first time since that book had arrived, he felt warm. The flames of the torches were heating his soul. But no, he couldn't stay here. And he didn't even want to stay here. In fact, in his mind, he didn't want to be near any form of sentient life ever again. He just despised the idea of being constantly reminded of what he had lost. But he knew that he was likely still immortal, and also trapped forever on this new world. As he didn't have the power anymore to go create a new world, nor did he have the knowledge to travel worlds. He was stuck here, whether he liked it or not. So, if he wanted this hypothetical new life away from any society, he would need to prepare. And that was going to be somewhat difficult, considering he was no longer some sort of omnipotent god. Instead, he was just an entity. Thus, he couldn't waste any time. He got to work. While all the villagers were sleeping, he snuck around the village, and he sheared some wool from the sheep, and created a small robe to wear. It was blue because, well, all the sheep were blue, but he was fine with that. He didn't really care, and he did quite like the colour blue. It was only meant to keep him warm and sheltered from the environment. The aesthetics weren't too important. But after doing that, he then harvested some seeds from the villagers' crops, and he stole some animals. And then he fled the village, ready for this new life. And so he flew around the overworld, looking for a place where he would never be found by anyone. And eventually, he believed he had found his place, as he had made his way into a flower forest, and it was thousands of blocks away from any form of civilization. It was perfect. And so it was there that Entity 505 set up his new life, as he built a small wooden hut against the cliffside, and he decorated it in the theme of his new blue aura. He also constructed a small crop farm to the side of the hut, as well as a small sheep farm on the opposite side of that. And then finally he built a small coarse dirt path, lined with blue flowers, leading into his house. The construction was complete. And for a brief moment, there was hope within Entity 505's soul, and a brief surge of power rushed through him, and his eyes began to glow once more. But it stopped there, and that was purely aesthetic. His powers didn't really grow from that. But anyways, after all that, his simple life began, as he then spent his days tending to the crops, baking bread, looking after the animals, subscribing, and writing. He used the farming to sustain himself and his animals. And with his time writing, he generated many unique books, detailing his life story, and writing about that mystical subscribe button. And so with thousands of books created, he constructed a wall of bookshelves to store his work. For Entity 505, this was a very simple life. His favourite part was when at sunset or sunrise, he would sit on the seats within the second floor of his hut and just watch over this peaceful world. In those moments he experienced true peace. He didn't feel the stress of being a god, he just felt awe at the immense grandeur of the sun before him. His life was great, and very quiet. For decades, this was his life, undisturbed by any and all other life forms. But, alas, this couldn't last forever, as slowly, the voices returned. They became more frantic and desperate. They spoke in a deeper tone, and were urging Entity 505 to help them, telling him that he needed to go somewhere. Now, Entity 505 didn't want to follow their instructions, because he loved his new life here, and he didn't exactly trust those voices. So he tried to ignore them, and continue with his peaceful life. But the voices just wouldn't keep quiet, and after many years of consistent pestering from the voices, he finally gave in to their demands, and he set off into the wilderness, following their directions. He had to travel across many lands, such as the mountains, and the swamps, and the subscribe button fields, until he arrived at a giant pine forest. The voices were getting louder now, and they were far more aggressive. They told him to follow the river. Again, he was reluctant, but he just wanted the voices to just go away. And so he followed their orders, hoping that if he did what they said, they would stop. And thus he made his way through the overgrown depths of the pines, following the path of that river, and directed by the compass of the voices. It was dark there, and Entity 505 really didn't like it, but he had to do it, as the voices told him to. And soon, he arrived at what they wanted, as he was standing before a small glowstone platform. The voices were really excited now, and they told him to stand on the platform. Entity 505 just hoped that this would be the final request, and that if he did this, he would be free at last. And thus, he did as he was told. But then... all that remained was a singular painting. A painting of a mountain. But before I can explain what happened next, you'll need to understand the origins of the paintings. And to do that, watch this video.